So the theme of our panel today is how are Canadian mines responding to carbon pricing. Before we get into that, I'm just going to introduce myself and ask each of the panel participants to introduce themselves. And then I'm going to provide a little bit of a contextual remark to set the tone for our discussion. So my name is Brendan Marshall. I'm the Vice President, Economic and Northern Affairs for the Mining Association of Canada. For those of you who don't know, MAC is the trade association for the mining industry at the federal level. So we represent the three mining companies that are participating in this panel and many of the others that are in attendance at this conference today. Part of my role and responsibility includes working on issues of energy and climate change. So, Gilles.
Yes, good morning. My name is Gilles Couture. I'm Manager Energy and Quality with ArcelorMittal Mining, also taking care of the greenhouse gas file with the company.
Hi, my name is Stéphane Robert. I'm working with Anico Eagle Mine. I'm Director of Regulatory Affairs.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Martin Vreau. I'm the Senior Director of Greenhouse Gas Reduction Technologies at the Ontario Centres of Excellence. And at OCE, we look after innovation and funding of programs on behalf of the province of Ontario. And in the context of this panel discussion, I look after the greenhouse gas file, which is, in addition to many sorts of programs, it is dealing specifically in this context with cap and trade revenues and how they can work on funding for industrial emission reduction programs.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Mark Aranto. I'm the Executive Vice President at Victoria Gold. We got a project up in Yukon. It's a open pit, 30,000 ton a day gold project, and we are currently in the development stage.
Thanks, guys. So just for some context, MAC, the Mining Association of Canada, supports establishing a pan-Canadian carbon pricing framework to incentivize economy-wide action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. To assist government in the development of an effective framework, MAC released Principles for Climate Change Policy Design. In that document, in addition to supporting a revenue-neutral price on carbon, MAC underscored the need for any climate change policy to ensure the competitiveness of emissions-intensive and trade-exposed sectors, as well as the necessity of being sensitive to the geographical realities of remote and northern regions. We also underscore the need to support industry investments in the development and implementation of technology to transition to a lower carbon economy. MAC believes that harnessing the power of the market through the broad-based carbon pricing is the most effective way to incentivize meaningful reductions in greenhouse gas emissions while maximizing company flexibility in determining site-specific mitigation pathways. Underscoring this point is important as, to date, MAC has participated in a plurality of policy and regulatory consultations in the climate change space. What concerns us is a potential scenario whereby existing or developing regulatory and policy initiatives results in double regulation of the same emissions in one or more respects, or in a way that conflicts with existing provincial initiatives in this space. This duplication would create additional reporting and compliance burden, frustrate private sector innovation, and generally blunt the incentive for corporations to take action, all without achieving significant additional greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The stakes are high if competitiveness considerations are not taken into account when addressing climate change. For example, if Canada becomes an uncompetitive jurisdiction to do mining, then our current market share will bleed to lower cost jurisdictions with a likely net increase in global emissions. This would be a situation where climate change policy perversely contributes to a loss-loss situation, whereby a sizable engine of the Canadian economy is diminished with adverse contributions to global emissions growth. So with that context, I'm going to open with a question for each of the panel participants. So from your standpoint, and acknowledging the plurality of policy and regulatory activities, what does balance look like for you in climate change, in the climate change and regulatory space? So Gilles, why don't we start with you?
Yes, okay. In our case, as you probably know, we are already under a cap and trade system since 2013 now in Quebec, along with California. So And before that, we have to say that in our case, energy represents 25% of the total cost of the operation. So it was already a big concern. At the pellet plant, because we have a pelletizing plant by the St. Lawrence River, the cost of energy is more than 40%. So considering this context, we have put in place a team, a specific team for energy efficiency, and considering the context in Quebec that hydroelectricity is available, we have ensured that we are maximizing the usage of hydroelectricity in Quebec, and on a day-to-day basis, we are working on the energy efficiency. Then we have developed what I call a strategic plan, considering all the options that we have in our context, and I will talk a little bit about it later, but we have tried to identify the best solution in terms of flexibility for us, because the context is that we have to use a lot of traditional hydrocarbons. We don't like to be captive to this product like the heavy fuel oil, the coal, the coke, metallurgical coke that we have to use, and we have decided to try to develop a better flexibility, because considering the volatility of the price of this product plus the value of the CO2, we consider it as a risk for the organization. So just to make a summary, natural gas and bio energy are the main topic that we have, main potential that we have identified, and I will explain to you later what we did about this strategy.
Thanks, Gilles. Stéphane?
Thank you, Brandon. So Anico Eagle, like Daniel said just before, we have 9 mines in Canada, Quebec, Nunavut, in Finland, Mexico, and we are employing around 7,500 persons in these 3 countries. In Quebec, we are on the cap and trade system, but because we are using hydroelectricity, it's not a big challenge for us, actually. But in Nunavut, it's another things. In Nunavut, it's really important for us. We think it's a platform for us, and we want to build from there. But we have main challenge there. We have 1 mine in operations, Meadowbank Mine, since 2010. We have the Meliadine project that Daniel just presented before, that we are in construction, that we should start in mid-2019. And we have another open pit satellite, Amaruq, that will feed the Meadowbank site. But the main challenge in Nunavut, like other part of the north, is lack of infrastructure. So just as an example, at Meadowbank, we had to build a 110 kilometers road, 100% financed by Anico Eagle, maintained by Anico Eagle, and will have to be reclaimed by Anico Eagle. And this road is the longest road in Nunavut, 110 kilometers. Here, it's nothing. But for us, it's really the main challenge that we have to live, because we have no port, nothing like that. So, and in the north is more expensive. We talk about 2 to 2.5 times more than in the south. So when we speak about carbon tax, for us, it's really a big challenge. Because Anico Eagle think we want to, this is really important to work on this. But in the north, because we don't have infrastructure, it's really difficult to make a big change in that, because we have no road, no power line, no port, and all that make that carbon tax is really a huge issue. So if we are talking about our 2 sites, Meadowbank and Meliadine, in 5 years, the carbon tax can cost us around $18 million by year, just on carbon tax. So for us, it's really, really main things. And what can we do? Because yes, we can put some wind turbine, we can put some solar panel, but this will reduce maybe 5–10%. It will not change. We are in the north in Nunavut where we have 4 hours of light actually, so solar will not work. Wind will work, but it will not replace all your energy that you need. So for us, carbon tax is a main issue, and we think that this should not apply the same way with remote mine than in the south. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Stéphane. Martin, over to you.
Thanks, Brandon. I think when looking at the various jurisdictions and plurality, as you say, of legislation, one of the biggest challenges that I see, looking after it from a very Ontario perspective, is we start to create a competitiveness that is like sub-sovereign competitiveness. We get competitiveness between jurisdictions within one federal jurisdiction, and then if you add to that, let's say non-regulated jurisdictions for which the emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors like mining have to compete in, it creates an additional challenge that you might be competing against another organization within your own organization just simply because it's in another province. And the various different programs you see, depending on where you're located, you could fall under a federal carbon tax backstop, which doesn't necessarily inject funding back into your industry, or you could be dealing with in a sector like Ontario where that cap and trade revenue is legislated to go back into things like industry and industrial emissions. So there you right away have a competition between Ontario and Nunavut within the same mining sector. And then another big challenge that we see in the applicants that are applying for our target GHG program and who are talking to us now about industrial reductions is the problem of long-standing supply chains that have pre-existed and predated all of this legislation, where you might have an ore extraction in one location but processing in another jurisdiction. And so then you run into what is the real cost of that supply chain and the impact on a cap and trade program on where the emissions might be spent. It suddenly turns into, processing it in offshore jurisdictions suddenly becomes more economical. And that's something that is never the intent of these types of cap and trade programs, but becomes the eventuality without care taken for emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors. So I think it's really having all of these programs is as much a detriment as as not having a program when you compare it to, let's say, the U.S. in the immediate trading areas around Ontario that don't have a program. All the differences are what are certainly creating challenges and on many levels, especially in supply chain.
Thanks for that context, Martin. Mark, over to you.
Thanks, Brendan. Victoria's Eagle project is up in Yukon, so we don't really have plurality of policy just yet, although it's probably coming. But I would like to expand a little bit on what Stéphane had started, and that's really looking at some of the challenges you face when you're doing a northern project in the context of carbon tax and what can be done. You get some pretty serious structural challenges in the north when you're competing to projects in the south in Canada or other jurisdictions, some of which you can't do much about. There is, you get long transport routes, just naturally you're at the end of the road if you're fortunate enough to be on a road. That has implications for your transport, increasing costs through carbon tax of fuels. You also have very limited sparse population, so you have additional costs like fly-in, fly-out camps, which again have a transportation cost, have a capital cost of camp, and some of the other things associated with cold weather, such as heating or cladding all your buildings. Those are just things that are structural, you can't do much about. Obligates projects in the north to be typically higher quality to get over the economic hurdle relative to other projects. But the other key thing, I think, with some of the structural challenges is the infrastructure deficit. You've got a general lack of roads, 110 kilometers being the longest one in NWT. You have a serious lack of power infrastructure, and you end up with a carbon tax that is structured in a way that doesn't allow you in the north, doesn't afford you many options to reduce greenhouse gases. You are very stuck with on-site generation, whether that's diesel or LNG or other things, but you just don't have the kind of capacity that you see, infrastructure capacity that you see in the south. So that's a challenge, and you know, I think taken simplistically with a carbon tax, it creates just another burden on these northern projects that that challenges them to compete with other projects. So I think it's something we need to look at in the north. Because the other thing is, this doesn't just go to the bottom line. When we see increased carbon tax, you know, we then need to squeeze suppliers who are also getting pressured by carbon tax to bring their costs down. These are local suppliers. You're not able to have the same wage structure or fewer people perhaps, which is limiting jobs in the north. And the other key thing, I think, is that First Nations agreements, most projects, mining projects in Canada have First Nations agreements. And the more you squeeze the project, the less value there is to share around. Doesn't matter how you cut it. So those are pretty key challenges that I think really need to be addressed from a northern perspective that just does not enjoy the infrastructure. And then very quickly, secondly, as a junior developer, which Victoria Gold is, we don't have the benefit of any revenues right now. Any carbon tax that we do absorb, certainly initially, is fairly punitive relative to an operator that can offset some of those taxes with revenues. And as a junior developer, we can put those into tax pools, but you're accruing these taxes at the most vulnerable times. So it's a particular challenge, I think, for a junior developer.
Thanks, Mark. So now I've prepared a single question for each of our respective panel participants. So, Stefan, we'll start with you. Agnico Eagle operates Meadowbank, the remote off-grid gold mine in Nunavut. How does the remoteness of Meadowbank affect the operation's ability to mitigate versus absorb the proposed carbon price as a cost of doing business? And secondly, what are the implications for the Meliadine project looking ahead?
Thank you, Brendan. For sure, it's really challenging because, like at Meadowbank, we have to use 65 million liters of fuel that we have to bring by boat in a 3 months period. 50% is used to generate power. So imagine more than 30 million only to generate your power with no power line, no hydro dam, nothing to help on that. And one of the big issue that we have, like at Meadowbank, we are actually permitting our open pit satellite that will be Amarok. And this open pit satellite, actually we have around 6 years of mine life. So Meadowbank, actually what we have in our book is 6 years. So if you say, okay, we will put a wind turbine, but in 6 years, the payback is 7 years. So it's really difficult to bring that. Even if I know that I will have probably a mine for 15, 20 years, maybe more, it's really difficult to solve that because I don't have the mine life that I can say, yes, I'm sure that I will have 10, 15 years. No, actually, what I'm sure is 6 years. And what is a big challenge we have like at Meadowbank, to do more than recuperate the heat, to heat our camp and do a lot of saving, but it's not something that will make a big change. we are emitted around, we have emission of GHG around 180,000 tons a year, and it's really difficult to have a major change. In Meliadine, what Daniel present is what we want to look is LNG. But the other big problem with LNG is the transportation and also the storage of that. How can we store that for 1 year? How can we transport that through the south via the Hudson Bay? That is a major challenge. But we think that we will be able to solve this kind of problem. But again, it will reduce the GHG, but it's not the big solution. We look at wind turbine. Again, it will. We look at nuclear. We look at different things, but after that, it will be the social license, because in Nunavut they don't have any wind turbines, so it will be the first one to be nuclear. That it will be a challenge to be able to permit only that. So that is the kind of challenge that we face off to be able to reduce our GHG.
Great. Thanks, Stéphane. Mark, I'm going to turn to you next. Victoria Gold's Eagle Mine is in development presently. And I understand there's a possibility to expand the Keno transmission line to service the mine. Can you provide some context around what this means for Eagle if that transmission line goes ahead or conversely doesn't? What are the implications?
Sure, thanks for that, Brendan. And I'll provide a little context so we kind of frame the size of the project and where it's at and some of the benefits. So this is a Central Yukon. It is a 30,000 ton a day heap leach operation. We've completed all the permits between 2010, 2015. We've got First Nations benefits agreements with the local First Nation. The project has got currently a projected 10-year mine life, reasonably expand to 15 years. But will contribute $85 million to the GDP annually to Yukon, which would make it the single largest private sector employer, 400 jobs annually, and it's about a $400 million build, so it'll be the largest private sector investment in Yukon history. So that's a little bit of context. We do have road access into site. We're one of the few projects in Yukon that enjoys that. That's thanks to previous miners. And we are fairly close. We're 45 kilometers from grid power. So we've been in discussions with Yukon Energy Corp. They're the local generator and transmitter of energy in Yukon. Recently, just 2 weeks ago, we signed a power purchase agreement with Yukon Energy to supply grid power to the project. Importantly, and this is the kind of backdrop to the project that Brendan mentioned, it's an old grid. We're really at the end of the northern portion of the grid. It is well past its useful life and has some real limitations in its capacity and reliability. So currently we're able to get, with the heap leach project, as we build the heap, the height of the heap, our pumping requirements go up and therefore our energy goes up. So first couple years as you ramp up and you start building the heap, we've got enough power. But beyond that, we either need to be looking at supplementing that power load with thermal on-site or off-site, I guess, or upgrading that grid. So the Stewart Keno transmission line is a project that would upgrade the grid. Back 8 years ago, Capstone developed the Minto mine and brought modern power, or upgraded power up to Stewart Crossing. And that's the northern extent of the infrastructure upgrade at the time. We're about 85 kilometers from that along the power line. So the upgrade would run from Stewart Crossing over to Keno City, hence the name, and we fit somewhere in between that. So that's a project that we're pursuing, hopefully with some green funding through the federal government and the territorial government, has broad First Nation support. As it relates to our project, it would result in 65,000 ton reduction in greenhouse gases annually. It would eliminate 400 B-train trucks of fuel. That would be 800 return trips. That's again an annual number. It would decrease our operating costs by about $18 million annually. If I don't know if somebody has a better number, they've forecast diesel, but somewhere in that range. And about $150 million life of mine. It would have very significant benefits to the First Nation in direct participation in our project through our IBA. And importantly, would generate $100 million worth of revenue to the Yukon Energy Corp that would otherwise be lost through basically spilled power in the summer. Summer they spill lots of power, in the wintertime they get very constrained, as you might expect in the north. That also translates into a small decrease in power rates for all Yukoners, but importantly eliminates what would otherwise be a very significant increase in rates for current ratepayers if Eagle does not come online. So it's a great project. It's another good example of mining helping develop infrastructure and also the benefits that are for the local community, but also broadly for Yukoners. So this is a green energy project. It's been permitted already by the government, so it's shovel ready. It's got broad First Nation support, and certainly and importantly, I think, has got a business case that would pay for that infrastructure over the life of the Eagle project.
So it seems, Mark, that it's cast in a sense, building off some of the remarks from Stefan, the remoteness factor in your case is slightly less of a viable pathway to connect and plug into the grid. But even still, just to give folks in the audience some context, you said you were about 85 kilometers from Keno there, or the connection would be 85 kilometers. I mean, in the Canadian context, when we're just shy of 10 million square kilometers, 85 kilometers distance from a transportation or from a power hub is still considered remote, requiring federal or other supports to facilitate that plug-in. So, important context on the extent of infrastructure deficit and the incremental costs required and investments required to overcome that. Gilles, I'm going to turn to you now. So you're handling more than 150 million tons of material of iron ore. As a large emitter of greenhouse gases, how do you deal with a cap and trade system in place, and what is your vision for the future?
Yes, effectively. In iron ore mine, like what we have, we are playing with the big volume. I explained to you that we have put in place a specific team for energy efficiency to go further in the potential project that we have, and we got so far good success. We are under the cap and trade since 5 years now, and we were able to stay under this cap, and we even have developed a bank of credit, if you want, so far. So we think that we will be able to continue like this until 2020 at least. But we didn't stop there. We have other ideas to continue to improve, and one of them is the natural gas, as I said. In fact, in the beginning of 2018, we will start a pilot test at the pellet plant. 6 burner will be converted to natural gas instead of heavy fuel oil, and we will ensure that the quality, the productivity of the plant is remain as high as it is right now by using this new fuel. We are very confident that we will be able to do it because other pellet plants in the world are using natural gas, but we have to do it to be sure, in order to be sure. The thing with natural gas is that we are conducting this pilot test in cooperation with the Gaz Metro in Quebec, and the government also is involved, because even if we have a success, there is no natural gas available in our area right now. So in parallel with the test, we have a coalition in order to find a way to bring natural gas in the area, because it's essential for this project. The other thing is that we have to consider the context where we are. We are far away from the big cities. We don't have access to natural gas, but we have access to some biomass which is available around. There is a sawmill at 1 kilometer of our operation, and since 3 to 4 years we spoke with these people and we said, you have energy in your yard, you have to manage it in terms of environment regulations, and on our side we need energy, we need gigajoule. When you said 150 million tons, just to give you an image, if we put the material that we are handling in the Olympic Stadium in Montreal, every week the stadium will be full of our material, every week. So even if we are efficient, we will still need, gigajoule to make the work, so the mechanical work. So by using, here in Ontario, there is a plant which is producing biofuel by pyrolysis, and we have conducted a pilot test with this material in our pellet plant. It was the first time in the world that this was tried, and with the Ensign people, the company is called Ensign, and our people, we were able to solve the problems, and we got a success with this test. So since that time, the company joined with the sawmill, and they are building a plant right beside our plant. It's a 100 million investment. This is the good news, okay, so far. The bad news of it, you know what it is? It is that the first production of this plant will not be available for us. Why? It is because this is considered in the US as a green product, and in US some states give a premium, an incentive to develop this product, so the revenue for the supplier will be higher to put this material in a truck going by the road to the US, and they will get the credit and the product, and we have participated to the development of the project, but we will not have access to the product for now. I'm happy that the plant will be there, and we have a lot of discussion with the government right now, and I think that we are in North America. We have to find a solution to this reality, because we will not succeed to get the objective that we have fixed with the government for 2030, So these are the kind of activities and projects that we have, and we have a pellet plant which is very productive, but one of the biggest risks of business is the energy, and this is why we're working on it, and we consider the greenhouse gas issues as also an opportunity to improve our operation.
Great, thanks for that, Gilles. Martin, gonna turn to you and sort of pivot a little bit. We've heard from the producers and the developers about some of the challenges that carbon pricing can present for project viability or competitiveness. I want to turn to you and get your sense on what some of the opportunities might be looking forward, and how, I guess specifically, maybe in the Ontario context, what some examples of these projects might look like. So from your standpoint, can you speak a little bit more about that and some of the work that you're doing in that space?
Sure, absolutely. It's one of, I think, the favorite things of my role at OC is I get to really look at all of the latest and greatest of emerging technologies and new innovative applications of old technologies to help drive sustainability and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But I will absolutely say that those innovations are definitely going to be trialed in the South, and with there is a strong chance that a lot of these technologies, and I'll get into some of the ones that I've been following and that we've been working with, that have really strong applicability in the North, just not today. And that's probably the most unfortunate thing, which I think certainly adds to a lot of the model in the Ontario context of cap and trade, where the emissions-intensive trade-exposed sectors are granted the free allowances, at least for this period, through 2020, to allow more and more of these technologies to develop and become more off-the-shelf, so that there can be a decision made in the post-2020 framework as to how that will be addressed, if it's still going to be granted, and things like that. So one of the interesting things that we've been seeing, and you mentioned pyrolysis, and there's some new technologies, and think of it in a way, it's kind of like next generation pyrolysis, where it's a hydrogen reduction technology that produces a methane hydrogen blended gas output but instead of CO2 emissions, produces carbon black emissions. And so from that perspective, you don't have CO2 emissions because you're not actually burning anything or heating anything up in a reducing atmosphere, which would be more typical of pyrolysis. So you can still start with the same biomass feedstocks, everything else, that you would do in order to get the methane out of that process that would also be greenhouse gas neutral. So that's something that is being looked at now, but certainly still relies upon a source of fuel, of biomass, to make it possible. Also works with wastes, so it can be an opportunity in remote communities where there might be a waste disposal issue that could consume some of those wastes and pull and extract those hydrocarbons out. So very interesting new innovations coming that way. Another one that everyone's familiar here with is looking at mine electrification, but that's not going to be so easily in the extreme north where you're remote and having to generate for yourself. So understanding that those are limitations there. So I won't get into that because that seems to be a fairly obvious one for a place where you can plug in. When looking at some of the next generation types of fuels and understanding that when your companies are investing in a generator, you hope that capital is going to be on a 20+ year lifespan. You don't want to wait for Martin and his group to bring you something in 5 years that you go, fantastic, is it going to work on my piece of equipment that still has 15 years of life or more left? And so a lot of these transitional types of technologies include things like making dimethyl ether, as an example, as a sort of drop-in diesel replacement with modifications to a fuel system, and certainly in a diesel generator that is dual fuel capable, it's pretty much ready right away for this type of fuel. Now, dimethyl ether is about 30% lower in greenhouse gas per gigajoule, so it's right on line with CNG, but it is stored in 6-bar non-cryogenic storage. So that's about 100 psi. So that becomes something very interesting from a storage perspective. Now take that to a further generation of it. What's interesting about dimethyl ether is, yes, you can make it from the black liquor of a pulp and paper plant, but you can interestingly make it by taking hydrogen, and I understand we'll get to the hydrogen a bit later, but you can take hydrogen gas and hydrogenate CO2 from an industrial facility and make methanol. Now, methanol stores as a liquid at room temperature. It could be very possible then to ship and store liquid methanol in non-pressurized vessels, stored easily, and then converted to dimethyl ether as it's needed to be processed as it's needed. So that becomes an interesting prospect where now you can be using methanol to fuel a diesel generator through off-the-shelf technologies that normally dehydrate methanol to make dimethyl ether or DME. So that's something that's very interesting because now you can capture the CO2 emissions from a steel refinery and then capture that with hydrogen, make methanol, and then make DME to fuel the diesel generators on site and vehicles as well. So now the question is the hydrogen. There's opportunities to make hydrogen not just from the previous process I talked about with the hydrogen reduction technology, because one of the spin-offs of that is hydrogen methane blended mix. But there's, right now, Ontario is exporting many megawatts to the US because nuclear power plants can't idle back. So when demand goes down, rather than export this, there becomes a grid opportunity to capture that electricity that would otherwise be exported at a negative price and process it into hydrogen gas, which then can be processed in the south where it's easy, and then shipped up north, as I say, in things like methanol liquid carriers, which is quite easy. On top of that, one of the things that I think when you're trying to say, okay, what can you do in different jurisdictions that, let's say, looking at Nunavut as an example, you can't participate in Ontario's program, but what you can do that really helps when I see all these struggling, innovative companies, what they need is a partnership in a large mining corporation that could be operating in Nunavut that can easily sign a non-binding memorandum of understanding that says, should your technology work, of course we'll buy that, because why wouldn't we want to do that if it works? And those non-binding letters are a lot of support when it comes to the investment community that says there's a market for this new widget that somebody's producing in the south where they can develop it for a future market in the north. So I think that that's something that I'll end on there, that if you're trying to figure out what can be done, those are the sorts of first steps, is to help in the development process for your own future, and it doesn't cost anything more than a signature in many cases.
Thanks for that, Martin. Just to tease out a little bit of what I heard from you, it seems like there's a lot of promising technologies that are being developed, but coming back to what we heard from some of the producers, we come up against that same barrier for the North. The infrastructure deficit really creates a limited playing field when it comes to deployment of some of these new opportunities. But also, I think you ended on a positive note here, where looking forward, piloting some of these possible technologies on a smaller scale could prove out potential mitigation opportunities and cost reduction opportunities looking forward. So we have a few minutes left in the panel, and I'd like to turn to the audience just to see if there were any questions that folks might like to take the opportunity to ask of our panel participants.
Seriously? How do you turn it on?
I'm as surprised as you are, sir.
My question, Brendan, is for you and possibly Martin as well, regarding LNG and realizing that a lot of these mining projects, especially one, for instance, the Melodine project, has limitations on delivery windows, maybe 4 months of the year because of ice. You know, it's not necessarily a new technology, but it's simply a supply chain hurdle for a lot of these projects is the storage, the LNG storage. You know, the energy density of diesel, you require 60% more storage for LNG versus diesel. So is there any, you know, lobbying that the Mining Association of Canada can make with regards to green funding to allocate some of those funds for maybe LNG storage? I mean, that's one of the biggest issues with LNG is the catch-22. They've already invested in diesel storage, and now you have to justify a whole new large storage facility. So that's my question, is regarding storage and getting funding.
Sure. So I can tell you that Mac and myself, I've worked closely with my counterpart at the Gas Association, Paul Chiliak. 4 years ago, we partnered in a feasibility study. We had 3 MAC members do some modeling about the cost viability and emission scoping of switching to gas. Specifically in the sort of joint advocacy space, we haven't undertaken efforts on a storage front. However, you know, MAC is supportive in principle of the work that the Gas Association is doing. I have a pretty open door for Paul and the crew over at CGA, and in fact, we're currently looking to. I was approached a few months ago to do an update on that feasibility study that we partnered on a few years ago. And the scoping for that was expanded to remote and northern regions. So I've reached into our membership and have found an interested member. So we're going to be doing another scoping exercise. And I think that questions such as the one that you raised about storage will be of particular interest for that work.
If I can just add a small detail about this, in Quebec we have a lot of promoters who work to bring natural gas in our area, and storage, as you said, is an issue. But at the end, it could be storage or transportation. You know, when you look at the cost per gigajoule in our case, it's very difficult so far without this kind of help to bring natural gas with an economic equation. You know.
If I can make one comment from an Ontario context, and unfortunately the programs I'm running are specifically in that Ontario context, but when you're looking at industrial fuel switching from, say, a diesel to an LNG, the capital that would be required for making that switch, which would include, say, fuel storage, would be something that would qualify for the funding programs that we look at. And so from that typical context, our target GHG program and programs in development are funding 50% of project capital up to $5 million. So if you have a project that's $10 million or more in total capex, you can receive $5 million towards that. which certainly goes a long way towards LNG storage options, at least to help reduce the risk and make it a potential viable choice. So those are certainly things that we look at in understanding that the Ontario's north is certainly a unique situation where we wouldn't necessarily look at it with the same eye as a industrial facility sitting on Lake Ontario with all the favoritism that logistics favors on sitting on a lake like that. So it is something that we would look at. So if there is a company here that is looking at options and opportunities in Ontario's north, we certainly would welcome discussing those programs with you.
Literally pass the mic.
Jump shot.
Okay. My name is Colin Murray, and I work with ICF, and our sweet spot is on the climate side and the energy efficiency side of consulting. And I've been working across Canada on the carbon policy and then implementing the carbon policy. And there's 2 points that I want to make here, and then a question after. The first one is that if we look at some of the carbon policy that's in place in BC, Alberta, Ontario, Quebec, it's very much a provincial policy, and the provinces are taking the vantage point of we want to own the solution so that the solution is best served to our constituents. And because of that, if your province chooses to go down a provincial route and not default to the feds, then what the provinces are and territories are lacking is the ideas to which get that money back into the economy. So greenhouse gas taxes and cap and trade systems, what I'm hearing from you right now is that you recognize that there is a problem, but the money that you're talking about, that future liability, that money is yours. It can be yours. You can actually get more than that back from the provincial carbon policies. So if you think of it that way, now is the time where the provinces are in the deep thinking that they need help. They need help from you to help understand how you can best benefit from that, having that carbon money reinvested into your facility. So the first concept I want to say is that money is yours, and you have the power to influence how it comes back to you. And the second one is that the provinces are very focused, and the territories very focused on the methodologies to obtain the carbon revenue. And from my own experience in working with the provinces, they then have the problem of how do we get it back into the economy? And they're not thinking that far ahead yet, nor do they know how it's to be done yet. Companies like ours help that, and we are working with some of the major energy consumers in the provinces that don't know what to do yet with their carbon revenues, and that's very much steering the carbon policy. So the way I look at it is you can either be a taker or a maker, and now's the sweet spot within that time frame to be a maker of the policy. So those are the 2 concepts, and then the question that I'm going to ask the panel specifically, or the mining guys, if you had a big pool of money that's yours, it's carbon revenue, what would you actually do with it within your facility? Would you invest in different technology, or would you invest in a biofuel? What would you do with that money? That's the question.
Well, I can say that you're right about the fact that we put the money in the Green Fund, and I can assure you that this is the kind of discussion that we have with the people within the government. But this is a battle, because the problem is that with the Green Fund, you can put the money for the transportation in the Montreal area, you know, for electrification. And even if the cost per ton of CO2 is very high for this project, you will get the support of a lot of electors, you know. So for a politician, it's probably very interesting. So this battle is not over, but there is also some opening to say that yes, we need the money to, and we have some solutions, some project that we have presented to the project that I spoke previously, and we need money to execute these projects, you know. So this is the kind of subject which is in the table in Quebec. I don't know what will be the end of it, but I agree with your statement about this.
So thanks for the question. I think it's a really good question. One of the issue, like in Nunavut, nothing is really talked about if they go with the backstop or if they do something, what they will do with the money. But if this money is available, one of the big challenges that we have in the north is infrastructure. And the mining company cannot by himself be able to, like a hydropower line, like for Manitoba, we talk about 1 billion. I don't have a mine that can support that. I need help from the federal, from other players. One of the big issues that we have is like where we are in Nunavut, in the Kivalik region, we are alone. We don't have another big industry. You can say, okay, yes, Nunavut, you have other mine, but the other mine, Nunavut is 20% of the Canada. And the other mine are there, and there. So that is really the big problem. And because of the lack of infrastructure, yes, you can put wind power, wind turbine, you can put solar, you can use LNG. But you will have some point that you will really that you cannot improve more without infrastructure.
Very quickly, certainly at Victoria Gold, in terms of energy requirements on site, we've done a lot of stuff already. We're getting energy recapture through conveyors, we're doing heat exchangers, variable speed drives. As much as we can reduce power at site, we've done some of those things. But you know, I think in Yukon's case, we would put that towards transmission of power. Yukon is actually one of the greenest grids in North America right now, with something like 98% of power coming from hydro. They do have a real deficit in transmission of that power, which creates some problems. So that would be what we would do, certainly. And you know, I just say in the north, some of the challenges with renewables, whether it's wind or solar, I mean, they really are inefficient when you need them the most, and that's typically in the winter. So transmission of existing power would be our bet.
Just one quick point, Colin. I've been working on Northern policy for 5 years, and I'm always very wary of sort of mapping south of 60 policies onto the north. And the notion that, well, aspirationally, I think it's a great notion, and I'd love it to see it come through, but the notion that these companies could reclaim every cent of the carbon price that they pay in the territories is just not it's not a policy palatable outcome. Because what you would have in that circumstance is the electorate bearing the you know, almost all of the burden of the carbon price relative to what their needs are. So the policy dynamics in the north are different in that respect from the south as well. We've thought about that, and it's a concern that we've sort of worked through a little bit. The only other point that I would say is I tend to agree with your view about takers versus makers. Mac's been quite proactive in the climate change space at the federal level, and we're very solutions oriented with respect to the recommendations and proposals that we've brought forward, not just in terms of, you know, how a pricing mechanism could be designed and applied, but also the whole scope of that policy package and reinvestment and innovation and energy efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. So do we have time for one more question, or ooh, I'm getting the scrunchy face. Sorry.
Much, Brendan, and thank you to this panel. Let's give them a round of applause.